It was very nice. So we had a little Oscar Toussaint moment, and I'm happy we had it, where a lecture turns into a performance and turns all our thinking upside down. So that was very welcome. And I think it also bridges over to Maitu and to the very beginning of the day when Philippe talked about Robert Smithson and the importance of fiction, because that's obviously, I think the only thing we found out today is that whole idea about countryside and the dichotomy between the city and the countryside is mostly, there is a certain amount of reality there, but there's a lot of fiction too. Right? It's also the way we think about things that maybe we should think about them in a different way. So exactly this experience I had a meeting with Maitu first when she was curating and writing, and then she started doing art by inventing a story. It was an interesting moment for all of us because all of a sudden art was generated by a story, not by the first an impulse or by a necessity or what seems to look like a necessity, but more like a story that then generates things and circles back into the story. I'm not saying more than that, but I'm very happy that you could come because for all of us back then, when you started venturing into that territory, I think it was a very inspiring time, and obviously still is, and I'm happy that you can share some of these thoughts here with us. Thank you, Maitu.
Oh no, actually I have one. I don't need it. So since we were talking about stories, I'll read a little story. No more city. I wake up and it's still dark around me. I can feel the smoldering ashes, the soft hiss of the wind against the sand, and when I open my eyes, there are roadrunners and jackrabbits hopping around the bush. I close my eyes again and roll against my friend sleeping next to me. If I feel cold, I can get up and close the curtains, light the fire again. If I'm too hot, I'll open them or go lie down on the chaiselong on the porch. Horses are waking up somewhere in the distance, the little ones running in circles around their mothers, begging to be fed. Something must already be awake next door. I can hear rumors of conversations, the sound of girls waking up, a faint peal of laughter, a yapping dog. It can't be later than 6 in the morning, and I remember that at this time in the city, I would still be fast asleep, lost in slumber, dreaming to escape. I remember the closed landscape, the sediment of meaning upon meaning, story upon story, oppression upon oppression. Suburban masses sleepwalking through waking life, from one gesture to the next, political prisoners of a grey-tinged nightmare. Have they ever known real darkness, real light? Do they ever wake up and long for a dawn that never vanishes? We are building the hacienda, a pyramid of love. Somewhere in the city, armies of cops are massing, manufacturing a confrontation. The banks are closed because they are afraid of the people. They are turning the people against the people. Petty bourgeois daddies are buying guns to protect their rented apartments and semi-detached houses, to protect their right to ride their leased BMWs from their TV screens to the bank and the insurance company. The houses are the sad prefab shells of what housing could have been. The city is a place where you can't get lost. It's an outside without an inside. We will not work to prolong a mechanical civilization and frigid architecture that ultimately leads to boring leisure and endless war. We were bored in the city. I remember a time when I believed that you could just get lost inside your head, inside your body, inside the city, drifting high on drugs, moving in and out of consciousness. When I thought I could still save something of that dying hull, find a space for myself and the ones I loved somewhere inside the cracks of the machine. Spacing out in front of a computer screen, answering the phone, never making anything that was truly mine. Caught in the dance of the machine. Here are some news. You can stop the groove. We have said no more. This world is a nightmare from which we have decided to awake. I dream with my eyes open. I close my eyes in order to see. So this is an old text from maybe 10 or 12 years ago, part of this narrative called the Crystal Frontier that Daniel was mentioning. That is the sort of point of origin or foundational story for my work, and it connects very well with the story of narcissism that Paco was talking about beforehand. It was quite perfect. How do you say? Enchaînement, I guess. Transition, or and so basically, I guess to make it, to try to make things a little narrative or simple, I began working as an artist in 1999, 2000, mainly because I was a failed writer, or I wanted to be a writer, but I couldn't make a narrative that I wasn't very good at plot, and I thought, okay. If the only thing I can do are postcards or sort of, how do you say, intuitive, kind of very short, very compressed sort of set of impressions or poems, actually the space of art or the space of visual arts is the perfect place, because it's a place where you can just make one thing and connect it to another thing and connect it to another thing and sort of build a narrative that way. And you don't necessarily, I felt I didn't necessarily to have an overarching plot, which was what was extremely difficult for me with the idea of making a novel or writing a novel. So I sort of fell into becoming an artist, I guess, because of that, and also because of, I guess, other friends who were artists. And at the same time, I had quite a, how do you say, heavy frustration with the idea of inspiration, or I guess maybe unlike the musicians that Paco was talking about beforehand, I was heavily skeptical of my own impulses or my own taste, let's say. So I thought, if I make, what I need is a machine. What I need is a machine to make my art, and that machine is going to be a narrative, is going to be a story. If I lay down the groundwork for the story, then the art will make itself, as in I'll do the work of the people in the story, and by way of this narrative, I'll escape myself. And this, I guess, is where I connect very intuitively, I guess, with all this yogic knowledge or Gnostic knowledge. It's this desire to lose yourself or not, escape yourself. So I made this story. The story is a story about a group of girls who decided to leave a big Western city unnamed, and also it's undated. The story is undated, so there is this sort of hovering, indeterminacy as to whether it's in the future or it's in the past or it's in the present, which I think is always this kind of unmooredness or timelessness, or the fact that it could be at different points, that different points in times can connect, is always fundamental to my work. And so these girls have left, and they're created an autonomous community in the desert of New Mexico. It's a female-only commune, and they are basically trying to renovate their relationship to themselves, to work, and to nature. So I don't know how well this is newer work, which maybe we can talk about later. It's since then I'm talking about something that is quite old, so the work has taken many detours, and I think this is my last image. This is a very old image. Yeah. So I basically started by making the objects or the artworks that these fictional people were making. This is, for example, a rabbit hutch. So I called it a pyramid of love, and I was really trying to imagine what the environment of these people would be. And this drive away from the city was always a very fundamental thing for me. Of course, it's also ridiculous because I'm a city girl. I've never lived in the country. I have no idea. And so for me, the country, the desert, it's as much of a fictional place or a mental, it's a non-site, basically. It's not really something from which I have a very, very experienced experience. But I guess I was also inspired by a lot of other artists and writers who worked with this topoi of getting away from the city and kind of creating a juster life in the countryside. For example, when I was putting together this talk, I got thinking again about William Morris, the leader of the arts and craft movement in in England in the 19th century. He was a communist, and he imagined a sort of utopian kind of future away from the horrors of industrializations and the horrors of I guess, mechanized society, which were already beginning at the time when he was writing, so sort of mid 19th century, mid to late 19th century. I was always, especially, I mean, I'm taken by everything about Morris, from the wallpapers and the love of, the obsession with pattern and furniture and sort of all the everyday things that one lives with, and which actually must be alive, I guess, is what he was saying, and especially with his novel News from, which maybe some of you know, this wonderful book called News from Nowhere, which is a kind of bizarre, kind of soft science fiction, 19th century soft science fiction book, which is where a character, Morris, is walking around on the river in England in the 19th century, so really in his present, and suddenly he feels very light and very good, and he realizes that he is somewhere else. He is in a kind of primordial medieval England where everything is beautiful, everybody gets on very well, there is no labor conflict, there is no poverty, there is no exploitation, and somehow this all happens through a kind of fantasized return to sorry, I'm sick. A pre-industrial past, a kind of medieval fantasy. And I always love these, again, maybe going back to these ideas of a cyclical time, or kind of time that goes back on itself, or that mirrors itself. I was always completely fascinated by the idea that the future would be the past. I guess there's a lot of this in the things that I'm, the works that I do as an artist. I don't know if I'm a bit freaked out by this time limit issue, so I don't know how I'm doing on time. I have 2 more minutes. News from Nowhere. So, other.
That's my fault.
No, it's good. It's good. I'm very happy to be squeezed into a very mouse hole of a. It's great. Life is unfair.
Let's make it better.
Huh? Yeah, it's true. No. So, anyways, I guess I'll go back to. I'll try to have some kind of form to my talk and go back to the communes. So, apart from Morris, of course, other influences being. Real communes or communities that were set, artist communities that were set in remote, whether desertic or simply countryside settings, such as, for example, in Switzerland, Monte Verita, which was this fascinating moment in the very early 20th century where kind of the people who were at the beginning of the very beginning of psychoanalysis, the very beginning of modern dance, and the very beginning of modern art met in the mountains of Ascona and Ticino to try to create a space of freedom, again, from the strictures and horrors of modernity. I guess, the Black Mountain. When I was putting together the talk, I thought again about how the space of Black Mountain College, for example, was also a fundamental influence on the work. So all this to completely hippie communes like the farm or things like this. Daniel, I'm good. So for me, I guess this countryside issue is it's interesting because it got me to think again about this ancient question of autonomy and retreat, and how as an artist you're constantly fighting, or I guess oscillating between engagement and retreat. And so and I guess the sort of mystical impulse, or the impulse to spiritual things or spiritual art, like, I don't know, through these things that I showed there. So this is okay. These are fighters. So this is not at all maybe the mystical side of the work. But I'm also involved with making small abstract paintings that are inspired by a lot of things like tantric art. So this urge to secede, to retreat, to go back inside, to concentrate, and to be away from all the bullshit. And then at the same time, this drive to be in the world, to fight, to demonstrate, and to be involved and to be part of the collective. I guess this tension, the sort of city-country divide is also kind of, how do you say it? It's also articulated this way. Maybe maybe ask some questions.
So one thing I was wondering, I have a similar experience, and maybe some of you as well, very fascinated by people who can tell stories. I think it's a great gift if you know how to tell stories. And I always have been fascinated by this thinking about, how much dynamic a story can develop. Can a figure then start to have its or her own dynamic and go into something else? So what is your experience? You started with this idea of this Crystal Frontier group, this story about this women community in the desert. They produce things, and you actually started to produce them, or other people started to produce them. So it's a narrative. So my question is, did you experience that, like, producing the artworks then would change the narrative?
Yeah, of course. I think what happened, and I think it was what I was secretly looking for from the beginning, was that I was writing the story, and then I made the artworks from the story, but then the artworks had their own created, without sounding completely crazy, the artwork had its own story and then took me on to other places. So, for example, it took me through historical lines that I hadn't expected. So I started from this commune story. I started looking back at other movements or other moments, and I started digging into all this Russian constructivist stuff and making all this work that was related to this. And then, it's all kind of, and I sort of like all this, in French you say, I am fascinated by what you call des récits enchâssés, stories that nest within stories. And so, for example, just to talk about one very recent body of work, I've been making this, all these mannequin figures. I've been making mannequins for a long time, but I recently went back to them under the rubric of this series called Les Guerrières. And Les Guerrières was this sort of weird, how do you say, it was like this connection of the discovery of what was going on in Syria with the Free State of Rojava in the Kurdish part of Syria, something extremely real, these where there are female armies. And the fact that I finally read a book by Monique Wittig that I always behaved like I knew it because it was so like my work that I had to pretend I'd read it, but I hadn't read it. I only read it like a couple of years ago, called Les Guerrières, which is an amazing feminist text about an army of women taking over the world. And so it all and then the fact that these armies all felt like they were like my women in the Crystal Frontier, and so this all kind of became one huge, cauldron or whatever, to make this work that is a total collage, I guess. I don't know. So that's where the stories take you, I guess. Yeah.
And it was also a way to revisit other stories and history, and then rework them.
Yeah, exactly. I can go on forever.
Maybe I open it to the public. It's getting dark in here, so I can't see anything anymore. So that's why I'm doing this. As anybody has a question to my two, back on?
Yes. I have one question. It's raised the question of the community of artists. Have you thought of creating yourself a community, or interested in actual today community of artists, or not artists, just people?
You mean to myself in real life go and live in a commune? Actually, not really. Although I think the closer I get to this is I do these Vipassana retreats, which are these moments when you go for 10 days and you sit in complete silence with people that you don't know. And I guess this but this is a retreating community. It's not an outgoing community. But I thought about it. But at the same time, I'm also, I think, a spoiled bourgeois individual woman in the 21st century. So I haven't done it. But yeah, I'm living that. How do you say that compromise?
Hi. When you told us about your work, it made me think of the work by a Turkish writer from Istanbul, Orhan Pamuk, who wrote the book The Museum of Innocence. And the interesting thing about his work is he wrote the story first, and based on the story he built the museum in Istanbul. And now we can explore the whole narrative in a museum. But it's not like, I've been there and it doesn't feel like a museum. It's more like a story. It's like really walking through a script. And I wonder, because your work solemnly or mainly that we saw is represented in a gallery space or a museum space, if you ever would consider to exhibit or produce your work outside of an institutional space, in what kind of space would that be?
Well, I think I love the museum and I hate the museum, and I think my work has always produced its true thinking of the museum as a space. I think I wouldn't. I like the how do you say, the belief in myself to. I mean that in a positive way. I'm not the kind to go out in the desert and build humongous concrete sculptures and all of this. I really. I think I'm really profoundly against it somehow. So in a way, the museum, I wait for the museum or the gallery or whatever to come to me and ask me to do something, and I respond and I make the work. I mean, in reality, I think it's like this. But I think it's interesting. Let's put it the other way. I think the space of the museum is interesting because it gives you something to bounce back against, and I find it very difficult to work if there isn't already a context. I think so. It's a bit of a contradiction in that I'm forever dealing with these ideas of freedom and I just say self-created worlds and so on. But at the same time, I always really need this. This context. I don't know if that's answering the question.
Oh, yeah, that's the last question. I was going to say one last question, and it's all the way in the back. So I'm happy that to end it, it's...
I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the concept of retreat, because if you build an army, obviously, I think immediately of attacking and the world, reproducing the woman, conquering from the retreat, going outside, especially if you have the reference to the Kurdish army. It's all about, a big revolution coming from the women's camp. So maybe you could talk about a little bit about the contrast.
But I think you do both at this. In a way, I think I'm interested in both at the same time, and I can never choose. I think maybe to take an example from like spiritual literature or whatever, there is, and during the Vietnam War, for example. Now I have a blank on his name. Shit. There is this Buddhist Zen monk who I love and whose name I've now completely forgotten, who always said that in order to fight, you had to be somehow spiritually empty and to have the space inside you to fight outside. So it's not. I don't think it's necessarily a contradictory thing. To retreat inside and then to move outside to fight. I guess I don't know if that's. And I think in the work it's just different moments of the work. There is a time of making groups or things that are collective or representations of the collective, and then there is the time of making miniature paintings. I guess that you can you have a lot of. I mean, life is quite long. You can if you're still alive, so you can keep on. You can do both at the same time, or at different moments of your life. I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you again, Maite. That was great.